Welcome to the New Masculine Podcast. This is a place where masculine identifying people come together in community to disrupt outdated models of masculinity and together construct new models for our way forward as men. As a special note, while this conversation is between men, this podcast values all beings and seeks to create positive impacts for all. I'm your host, Travis Stock. I am a master life coach, an equus coach, which means I often partner with horses when supporting clients, and I'm a teacher. In my coaching work, I am passionate about the balance of masculine and feminine energies in each of us, regardless of gender. I seek to help others nurture a relationship with both types of energy, which often leads to a greater sense of wholeness. And yet what I found in my work with men is that many of us have been taught messages about what it means to be a man by first teaching us to avoid anything that is associated with the feminine. That avoidance leads to few experiences of intimacy, emotions outside of anger, vulnerability, or even a sense of belonging. Striving to comply with these models of masculinity has many of us feeling isolated, ashamed, unworthy, afraid, angry, and depressed. That's why I started this podcast, to bring men together who are ready for something new, something more whole. I connected with my next guest earlier in the year during our series on the work of the Task Force on Boys in Schools out of the American Psychological Association. For me, our chat felt very enlivening, connected, and made me really excited to feature his voice on The New Masculine. He was at the time, however, in the process of deepening his work with boys, which would be featured in the new book he was writing. So we decided to hold our conversation when he could share more. And now it's time. Christopher Reigeluth is an author, assistant professor, and child psychologist whose new book is titled The Masculinity Workbook for Teens: Discover What Being a Guy Means to You. In the book, he seeks to help teen boys be curious about what they've learned about being a man and recognize that conforming to masculine gender norms is a choice, not a requirement. From there, he helps the reader create their own definition of masculinity, one that's on their own terms and true to them. On a personal level, Chris identifies as a father, as a husband, as an outdoorsperson, and as a psychologist. I'm super excited to hear about this man, his insights, and to share his work with all of you. So without further ado, welcome to The New Masculine, Chris.
Great. Thanks to be here, Travis. Really looking forward to where things go in this conversation.
Me too. I had such a nice time connecting with you. It was maybe like February, March of earlier this year, and you were in the process of becoming a dad to a second child and putting a book out, putting a book down into writing so that you could put it out coming up soon.
I know a lot has changed since then. And I remember just that half an hour conversation we had feeling very natural and very comfortable, and in some ways feeling saddened to put it off for half a year, but I'm glad that we did.
Oh, I felt that same sadness. But also, thank you. You also connected me with some really quality men that have been featured on the podcast that have been really excited to connect with. So in many ways, while we were saddened to have to put it off a little bit, it actually worked out really well for me and worked out for The New Masculine really well. And I hope this conversation now gets to be really powerful.
Yeah, me too. Thank you.
Yeah. So I mentioned a few things about you in the intro to the podcast. Is there anything else you'd like to share about yourself that helps people kind of understand who you are before we jump in?
Yeah, I guess the other thing that I'll highlight is I'm a clinical psychologist, and somewhat unique in that regard, in that my focus has been working with kids and teens, but very much from the beginning of my training, I worked closely with a clinical psychologist and Professor Michael Addis, who's done a lot of work on masculinities and mental health. And that was a real draw for me to the field, and early on wanting to understand more about boys and their well-being and their psychological development, and specifically ways that messages that they get from pretty early on about what it means to be a man and how they should be can influence them in varying ways. Being a guy there's a lot of diversity that goes within that. It can be easy to essentialize, and the journey is different for all of us. But one thing that is similar are that we can mostly all relate to these messages that we get growing up about how we should be, what we should do with emotions, how we should prove ourselves. And then kind of, the outcomes from those messages are what can differ a lot. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about that and researching that, and now have this book coming out that I'm excited for.
What a solid mentor you had. Michael was on the podcast before, and I really enjoyed connecting with him. So what a solid mentor. And I totally get why that's been a helpful part of your journey.
Yeah, I was really fortunate to have him as kind of the mentor for 6 years that he was, and he and I continue to be friends. And also, as a graduate student, some of my more favorable moments were playing disc golf with him, and just getting out and throwing the disc around, and not talking about psychology stuff.
Yeah, love it when you can actually like get out there and do some things together rather than just doing the like sort of clinical part or the educational aspect of it, but then you can go be just men out there in the world.
Yep, exactly.
So I'm very clear we're going to have a lot to talk about in terms of what you're offering in terms of your work. I'd love to start first by connecting with you as a man, just to see what are your stories, who are you in this world, and maybe why are some of your perspectives shaped in the ways that they are. So if you sort of scan back through the earlier parts of your life, what comes to mind when you think about some of the lessons you personally learned as a man, as a boy growing into a man? Who were your sort of models of masculinity? Tell me a little bit about your background.
Yeah. So I grew up on the East Coast in, a middle to upper middle class area. Very white with regard to the racial composition, not a lot of people of color, although close to New York City. So could, take the train into the city and see people of all different backgrounds, but certainly not in the immediate environment. And there really weren't opportunities or invitations to question gender when I was growing up. Nobody ever invited me or asked me what being a guy means to me. Nobody ever taught me to understand the difference between gender and sex, or that, as you noted, that which I've come to believe and find in my own journey, that gender is a choice, but it's not a requirement. Masculinity is a choice, not a requirement. And so it didn't ever strike me growing up that I could push back against the dominant masculinity teachings with regard to the importance of being tough for boys, the importance of not showing emotion. Right, as you get older and into high school, more pressure to demonstrate sexual success, and specifically in a heterosexual way, kind of being powerful, being more of an alpha. Right, all norms that have been, demonstrated by researchers to exist in our social fabric, and to be masculine gender socialization messages that pretty much all boys, and interestingly, right, cross-culturally, are indoctrinated into. And then, what is done with those messages is really where the variation and the diversity is. I don't feel like I had a particularly intensive or repressed childhood with regard to the masculine figures who were most important to me, which was really my dad, first and foremost. A very loving father. He came home at the end of his workday. He went into New York City, and it was a more kind of traditional dynamic in my family that doesn't happen as much today. But my mom's work was at home and raising us and taking care of the house, and he would go off and earn money in New York City, and would come home, singing. And he was always very into the theater and the arts, which is not a traditionally masculine thing. And always felt very supported by my parents with whatever my interests were. I was never told, don't do that because that's not for boys. But just with the environment in general, with our neighborhood, with the places that we went, very much received the message, oftentimes directly from other kids, sometimes from coaches, that this is how you should be as a guy. As well as from my dad, just through modeling. He was very into sports, watched football every weekend, and definitely, vulnerability at times, and got that modeling from him, but also kind of at other times could tell that emotional expression was a little bit more complicated and challenging than it was for my mother.
Yeah. One of the things that I'm hearing in this that I want to pull you out a little bit on, because it's come up with a couple of others who I've talked to who are in like the mental health field, where we're used to using a certain kind of language that makes sense and it's technically correct. But I wonder what a listener who hasn't done a whole lot of work around sort of understanding gender and questioning gender, what that might actually mean. So you were talking about the concept of weren't raised to be able to question gender. I think in our current time frame right now, we've seen so many people questioning gender in terms of how they identify, how they show up in the world, whether that's through pronouns, whether that's through being trans in some way. And so we've had these conversations around questioning gender that look a specific type of way. When you say you weren't taught to question gender, what do you mean by that specifically?
Yeah, well, it means different things to me. In kind of one sense of that statement, I wasn't exposed to gender diversity. And so outside of binary ways of being, kind of, man, woman, boy, girl ways of being, like that was the clear expectation. That was kind of how my society was. That was what I saw for, when I went to birthday parties, when I went kind of out to dinner, when I did stuff in the community, the only thing that I saw was kind of binary gender
pink or blue
models of being pink or blue. And so, choose one, but actually kind of one has been selected for you, right? Because of what you were born with. So that's part of it. And then the other part of it is kind of less of the observational and more of the overt. And I don't, I'm going to try not to plug my book too much, but something the book tries to do, but really something that I just want for all kids is invitations to question and explore all different aspects of themselves, and to have trusted, safe people who they can do that with, and people who kind of encourage risk taking and encourage thinking about different possibilities, and who really very directly provide the message that who you are is up to you. And there are lots of ways to be. And childhood and adolescence is for figuring that out. And society is going to try to plop down some very clear blueprints and expectations and limit you within certain parameters, and don't let them, because it's up to you and nobody else. And nobody gave me that message, as much as I absolutely came from a loving family, incredibly supportive, had lots of privilege and opportunity. I never got that message. I actually didn't get that message until college, which we'll get to, when I actually was invited to start to think more critically about who I am as a gendered person. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I'm so grateful that you said that, because I think what it tells us is that even those of us that identify as men, who sort of our gender identity and our biological sex match up, and we are not sort of considering either changing our gender or identifying in different ways, we can still question gender, and we advise questioning gender, meaning like questioning the things that society will try to plop down on you as what you need to be in order to be successful at performing your gender. What are the rules that you need to show up, like to model after, so that you can be successful, belong, achieve, all those kinds of things. And so it gives permission for those of us that do identify with the sort of gender we were assigned at birth. We also get to question what we were taught about that and start to define it for ourselves.
Yeah. I love hearing you say that. And there's a response that I'll give to some people when presenting sometimes, and I'm asked, but isn't it just natural for guys to want to be tough and to want to be in control and want to be strong and to have a harder time with those soft, mushy emotions and to be into sports and whatnot? And I'll say, well, when I look around the world, it doesn't actually seem to be all that natural, because I see guys who identify as guys doing all different types of stuff into different styles and ways of dressing, dispositionally very diverse. And so maybe for some it is, but for plenty it's not, or kind of maybe there are aspects of that work for them and other aspects of that kind of blueprint that don't. And so they get to self-create and still identify as guys as much as they want.
Yeah, I love that self-create thing. I think that's the point of it. It's not to create based on the map that was already given you or the model that was already given to you. It's like self-create. I love the permission that gives to other men out there. So let's talk about a little bit about your self-creation journey. Like, what have you found in your questioning of gender for yourself? What have you found in your self-creation for yourself that's important? And a sort of a indication of what your journey's been with the sort of genderized masculinity thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, in my later years, and right, it's an ongoing process. I'm a masculinities researcher and a masculinities interested clinician in my work with boys, and men too. But it's continues to be an ongoing process for me. And just
Same.
my own self discovery.
Same.
I have not figured out most of it yet. Colors are important to me, right? So I'm not modeling that well right now, but in my earlier years, not when I was like a little kid, like I've seen some pictures of myself as a little kid, and I wore kind of jams, which some listeners will know what those are, very like brightly colored shorts that had kind of all sorts of neons going on. But, I think as I started to kind of take in more of the masculinity messaging stuff, I just started to wear more traditional guy type colors, bold colors, darker colors. And as an adult, I wear that stuff sometimes, but I also wear more bright colors and more energetic colors and colors not as overtly associated with masculinity. So I'm more colorful. I smile more. One of the things that I can just like see it when I see pictures of myself as a boy. I was just very serious. It's like, I had the world on my shoulders in these family pictures and in other pictures, and just not a lot of levity, not a lot of smiling. And I learn this from my kids every day, the importance of just smiling and lightness and being playful and being silly and showing that type of vulnerability, because there is a vulnerability in that playfulness, and not having to be so contained and stoic, which was something that I really took to heart as a kid and a teenager, and with some of the masculinity messaging that I definitely absorbed in a big way that wasn't so helpful for me. And that all of my emotions are important. And it's one of the things I want to pass on to my son, from the very beginning, and my daughter, because I have two kids, that all of our emotions are important, and they're what, make life beautiful and difficult, and sad and happy, and really trying to connect with other people in those more emotionally kind of complex and full ways.
Yeah, it's interesting how many of us have really internalized that message that inexpressiveness and stoicism is sort of like what we should be doing. I remember my own like adolescence growing up as a boy who knew he was gay but wasn't ready to talk about that, was afraid of that identity. For me, I was watching myself in pictures, or if there were videos taken of me, and I would watch my hand expressions, and I was like, oh, no, that's not safe. And I would learn how to be more inexpressive. I would learn how to be less expressive with my face. And for anybody that knows me, my face gives away everything, and it's fully expressive. And so there's no hiding how I feel when it comes to my face. And so I started learning how to deaden that and how to dull that as well. And so it's interesting how many of us learn that. And now I look at that and I start to go like, such an interesting thing to teach little boys, that almost like a vacancy is what they should be showing up with, that they're not impacted or not enjoying something or not feeling something. That's so interesting to me.
Yeah. And also that we typically will think about the emotions to repress, being, sadness as one of, or shame. But the other emotion that typically will also just fall within that grouping is happiness, because there's a vulnerability to happiness, and all of those emotions are important. But how sad that sometimes people and boys in particular will feel like they have to hide joy or hide happiness because of those pressures of stoicism and just kind of seeming like you've got it all contained. For me, I remember starting to realize in high school that this isn't working for me, and I'm having to try too hard to fit in. And I remember freshman and sophomore year, like really trying hard to kind of fit in and do the masculinity stuff to the max. And then junior and sophomore year, I had like started to have pushback and was just kind of, and I think some of it was from not being very successful. I think if I had been very successful and had been one of the cool kids, I probably would have kept going with it.
Yeah.
But in part out of it, like just like not being a natural thing for me, I was just like, well, screw it. Like this isn't working. I'm not happy. I'm not one of the cool kids. And so like, let's try to figure out what does work for me. What does feel right.
It's a brave act for a high school and adolescence kind of age group. I resonate with that part that was like you weren't being very successful at it. Yeah, I was the band kid. I was not following the traditional things. I gave up being in soccer and different sports that I was playing because I more wanted to be in the band. And there were conflicting schedules, and so I was like, well, I'm not doing well with this, so I better find some friend group that I can hang out with here and find some identity in there. And it is those of us that don't fit the norms that are having to sort of step into some bravery a bit earlier than other people are and to start questioning these things.
Yeah, totally. And I remember, and I think resonating with your journey for a while, it just became more of an internal thing, right? Like I'm starting to become internally aware with my own self-awareness that some of these ways of being, because it's not all, but some of the expectations being placed on me and things I need to do to get more status and recognition in my school community or wherever else just aren't feeling right. So for a while that awareness wasn't there, and it just hurt and was frustrating and made me feel like there was something wrong with me. And then eventually, as that awareness started to come into place, yeah, there could be a little bit more self-compassion. There could also just be, some anger at, not being as accepted as I wanted from other people, and just kind of like some rejection of that. And then I think, yeah, it did start to get more overt, but initially just started as a more quiet, introspective process, which is a really important part of the journey, I think, for all people, like internally knowing who you are, and then, needing to do some evaluation of the environment, like where can I safely show my full colors? But we can't always, sadly, in this world, show our full colors because there can be dangers and threats out there. So when do I need to keep things more under wraps and consciously know why I'm doing that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that consciousness piece. So many of us practice it so much that we become unconscious to where we're holding back, where we're not showing up in the world, and then it becomes the normal operating system. Whereas if we can choose it, when we can utilize it as a skill set rather than as something that has chosen us and now takes us on a ride, that's, I think, a really important part. What you were saying around the anger that came up, so much of what we already acknowledge oftentimes with men is that men are allowed to feel anger. That's one of the few emotions we are allowed to feel and express and to take up a lot of space with. And yet often what I see is that it's done in pretty destructive ways. It either fractures relationships, it feels dominating, it's overpowering, it doesn't actually add to anything. And yet the way that I'm hearing you talk about it is as you started to get angry about sort of the way you were feeling, in some ways it helped fuel your self-awareness process, your courage to continue finding yourself. It almost became a constructive thing rather than a destructive thing for you.
Yeah, it did feel constructive, and it certainly wasn't only anger. There was sadness as part of it, but there definitely was also some straight up anger. And I think as I became more understanding of where this gender stuff comes from, what these teachings are all about, I got upset in multiple ways, and it has contributed to my work. But part of the upset was when I got to college and took Gender, Race, and the Politics of Difference. And that course was with Professor Cheshire Calhoun, and then I took another course, Feminism and Film Theory, with Laurie Osborne. I'm pretty sure in both courses, definitely in kind of the first course, I walked into a room of 30 people, and it didn't appear that there were, at least from appearance sake, there weren't any masculine identifying people in the room. I was the only one. And that was really the first time I had been that outnumbered with regard to my gender identity. But it was the first time that I was invited and encouraged to just like think more critically about gender, systems of oppression, how men get socialized with regard to gender. And what made me angry was that I hadn't been invited at an earlier age. And what made me angry was when I really started to make contact with ways that I had suffered because of trying to fit myself so fully into a box that wasn't a great fit, right? Certain aspects of masculinity like totally work for me, but certain aspects weren't, and it wasn't being able to kind of meet the expectations of those aspects, whether it was the emotional stuff, whether it was the hypersexuality stuff, that brought a lot of pain. And so it was anger at like, why am I in my early 20s and like only now starting to be encouraged to do this type of self-exploration? Like, frankly, like, where were my parents with this? Where were like teachers? Like when I was like being educated as a kid, like, why is this like only happening now? And frankly, like, it was kind of like, what the fuck? Like, this makes me so upset. And I feel like I lost out on things because of that.
Wow. It makes me feel so much like respect for you that at 20, that's how you were integrating that information, that you were angry that you weren't invited to that conversation earlier, instead of what we're sort of seeing in certain sections of masculinity work out there is that being able to question these and being a part of these conversations is actually a threat to masculinity. It's a threat to manhood in some populations out there. And so I think that there are lots of men that would see that questioning or that invitation into that kind of conversation as sort of feminizing in some way and a threat to their masculinity. And so the fact that you received it as like, well, I wanted to be here earlier. What do you mean? I'm missing out on things. I wanted this earlier. It's just really powerful to hear you be able to meet that moment and respond in that way.
Thank you. Yeah. And sorry about the F-bomb. You might need to edit that out, but it felt appropriate.
Oh, it's staying in there.
But yeah, I think, I went through that process of that painful process of repression and trying so hard to prove myself as masculine in the way that society wanted me to be, in my earlier teenage years, that at that point I had gotten to college, and it felt like such a bigger fishbowl than where I'd gone to high school. Like I was seeing more just diversity, more different types of people. And I really felt embraced and emboldened in ways to want to self-explore more. And so finding myself in a class like Gender, Race, and the Politics of Difference, you don't sign up for that class if you don't want to be challenged, if you don't want to be made to feel uncomfortable. And so I was really ready for it.
You'd already given it permission to challenge you a little bit. Yeah, I hear that.
Yeah.
It was interesting for me. I didn't really know as I was starting to develop my career that I was signing up for such female-dominated professions. And so as a social worker prior to being a coach, I was like thinking that it was just like, oh, everybody goes here. And then I was like, oh, okay, I'm one of the few men here. And even in my coaching journey and personal development, self-help stuff, it's quite a lot of the biggest population that's present is sort of that middle-aged woman that's in there that's looking to find out more about themselves. I always joke that when men are going through that process, they buy themselves things in order to navigate who they are and their changing identities. And women often go inward and they want that like eat, pray, love experience of finding out more of depth about themselves. And so it's interesting to continue to be a masculine identifying person in pretty female dominated spaces. And what does that continuously ask us to question, look at? How do we need to show up in the world because of the space that we occupy in those worlds? I think it's just a really interesting thing that I consistently play with in my mind as I stay in these fields.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, I can definitely relate being a clinical psychologist. And, white heterosexual men don't get the opportunities to experience being in the minority very often.
Mm-hmm.
But when you do psychology, you certainly do with regard to that profession. And I played sports growing up and love sports. I mean, that's one of the things that's an important part of my identity. And, sure, there's some masculinity in there, but it's really part of my human identity. Sports is something that gets tagged as a masculine thing, but I really, that doesn't line up with how I view it, because I think sports is something for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And I also sang in the choir in high school, and I was in the community service club, and did other things that weren't considered prototypically masculine. I let myself do them more and more as I kind of went through that resistance period that I told you about, and didn't feel like I had to pretend and posture so much. But so I feel like I played rugby in college, so I feel like I've had this interesting hybrid of, I've been in some of the most like masculine typical settings, and I've like observed those and felt those. And for my professional career and the courses I took, and I was an English major, I've also very much experienced things that are, considered to be encoded as more feminine by society.
And so in that journey of pushing against, questioning, what are some of the key takeaways you have for your own masculinity? I think in your book, and one of the things that's sort of what helps define it is it's helping teens really define masculinity on their own terms. Mm-hmm. Now that you've been through your own journey and are at the age that you're at now, what are some of the highlights of what creates sort of your masculinity?
Yeah. It's a challenging thing for me to answer.
I kind of felt like it might be. It's a big question to ask, but I like to find out what are the themes that you've found out as you've continued your exploration.
Right. Well, and also I think, in part, I'm trying to like think how to approach it, because in part that was why on the questionnaire I changed outdoorsman to outdoor person.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, because, and I wouldn't use the word traumatic as a clinical psychologist, that wouldn't feel appropriate to me, but in some ways, because masculinity felt like such a forced thing upon me when I was a kid, that I got such intense doses of throughout childhood, and never was invited to question. As I've like started to question and critique it more for myself, it can be like harder to feel comfortable identifying like things as masculine within me, if that makes sense, even though I very much feel myself identifying as a guy. There are cultural reasons for that. There's just, frankly, like some comfort in it, based on my own growing up experiences.
In some ways, as you start to question and as you start to really reflect on what the best parts and the challenges that sort of our concept of as a culture around masculinity has done to you in some ways, it sounds like you're starting to, it's becoming less and less important as a part of your identity, the way that you self-identify. There are other parts of you that move to the front while other parts sort of move to the back, or are just there without needing to really kind of discuss, maybe?
Yeah. And in some ways, it's also, right. And I'm a clinical psychologist who works with all different people of all different backgrounds in all different places of their gender journeys, people who identify in more stereotypically masculine ways, and that like totally works for them. And that's very much how the book is framed, right? This is not about being prescriptive or trying to change anyone. And I think for me, with my own journey, as someone who still identifies as a guy, labels feel limiting. Labels can feel very limiting. And yes, I identify as a father. I identify as a father who cares about emotions, who loves to roughhouse and playfully wrestle with his son, loves to sit with my son when he's feeling emotional, want to like protect those emotions for him, and like worry so much that society is going to try to just kind of take his like just raw vulnerability away from him the way that it did for me. And so I guess, yeah, I mean, there's a protective aspect of my personhood that, maybe because I identify as a guy would be, appropriate to say as part of my new masculine, or kind of me trying to recover some of those lost emotions. Not having had as much practice being vulnerable in my childhood years and adolescent years, because I was getting the message that guys should be tough and guys should suck it up, and there's not a place for this. And so like, how can I like work on those specific ways of being, and kind of muscles and brain connections that like haven't had as much activity as they should. What I sometimes worry about, though, with saying this is part of my masculinity is, and this is why I get uncomfortable with it, to be clear, is I worry that people can then take that as, okay, so like Chris is like still like identifying that as something that for guys that he holds on to that isn't for other groups. I was presenting at a conference once, and I was talking about the ways that rigid conformity to like masculinity stuff can have problematic outcomes for some boys and men with regard to like exactly what we're talking about. And some of the people in the audience said, well, but how about like the positive stuff, right? Like bravery and strength and caregiving, that are also like part of like masculinity and being a guy. And my response to them was, sure, like those things are great, but like, aren't those things great for all people? Like, I know people of other genders who are very brave and very resilient and very tough. And so why would I like claim that as something unique for my gender group that I identify with?
I appreciate that way that you're talking about this, because I do think it is very easy when we start to identify values of ours that represent our version of masculinity or our manhood. It can sort of seem like it's an exclusionary club where only men get to have that, or only masculine identifying people. And I think that's so in alignment with my values, is that as we identify positive strengths or positive value systems or positive energetic ways of embodying ourselves, that we make those more accessible to all, and that those we're more inclusive in the way that those are available to everybody, that we don't limit others based on what I've now identified as good for me. And it is interesting how often that can be something that happens.
Yeah. And the other thing I was going to say, well, one, like I'm definitely like aware of things that don't come as naturally to me based on how I was raised, and just kind of based on that being the framework I was operating in during all of those formative brain development years. And like most of our brain development, and I've learned as a clinical psychologist, like happens through adolescence. And then there's like some more that happens, but it starts to happen more slowly. And then like executive functioning skills are fully developed usually by the mid-20s. But like, because of that, I definitely like feel like there are some things that are harder at times. Like I have to work harder at emotional vulnerability. And I didn't get as much experience with that growing up, even though we know that boys, when they're kind of like in their early childhood period, actually like are more emotionally expressive visibly than girls, and like are more visibly upset and cry more often. And then it kind of starts to shift on them.
I think that's so important to highlight is that, because I've heard of this in previous conversations with other researchers around this, is that boys are often more expressive.
Yeah.
And then you can watch at certain age groups where the expressiveness stops, and how early on, even before verbal language is really on board to be able to tell them don't do this or do this, they start to take in the messages and they start to become more inexpressive and more stoic just by what they're pulling in and absorbing from their environment.
Yeah, and as they start to identify with father figures, right? For some, right? Some boys have very vulnerable and expressive father figures, and lots don't. There definitely like some things. I was thinking like last night about this, just as I was reflecting on doing this today a little bit. Like there definitely like some things that I'm still participate in that are very prototypically masculine. And I think what has shifted for me is I'm more critical of them. Like there's more of a critical process that happens. And I'm also like, but that's kind of like how I was raised. And that's like part of my fabric. Like I'm comfortable watching football with my dad, even though it makes me uncomfortable how cheerleaders, and specifically women cheerleaders, are sexually objectified with what they're wearing. Even how just kind of like some of the ways the announcing is done seems like really just like limited and hyper masculine, and the culture around that sport, right? Kind of the intense focus on violence and aggression makes me uncomfortable. It's something that I did a lot growing up with my dad. And so, I still watch football, and enjoy some of the great plays, even though I'm much more critical of like something like that now. So it's complicated for me.
It is complicated. And I think that those complicated places where sort of two truths exist at once is really important for us as men to get more comfortable with and to be able to sit with that, to be able to hold in both of our hands two truths that exist and to understand nuance. I think so often in our culture, we just have to create very like black and white rules, or we have to agree with something or disagree and reject something or cancel something. Like it can be very brittle and very like not nuanced, very just kind of like too obtuse in some ways. And so I think that's a really important skill for us as men and part of our emotional development, to be able to hold two truths as one at once without fracturing, without breaking in some way. It helps us be more malleable in the world.
Yeah, I like that way of putting it. Two truths at once. Yeah.
It's not something we're necessarily taught how to do. We're supposed to know the right answer.
Yeah.
And yet there can be multiple right answers. And I think our like sort of short form social media, internet based lives that we're all living just keeps perpetuating that, not just for men, but for a lot of us, is that it has to be quick decision, has to be right decision, and it has to be in alignment where we don't get sort of rejected, canceled, or demonized in some way.
Yeah, and I'm aware that this is going to be one of my wishes for men. Right, being able to be tough, being able to be strong, and being able to be emotionally vulnerable, and being able to be raw, and being able to sometimes feel very insecure or very unsure, and having that all part of the pot. Right, all those things can be in there. It doesn't just have to be the toughness, or it doesn't just have to be the power, because humanity is so much more complex than that.
Yeah, the complexity represents the wholeness of us rather than just little parts of ourselves. I mean, you and I were going into this conversation talking about the sort of balance for us as professionals in the mental health space around what are our professional boundaries around what we share about ourselves or what we say, so that we don't isolate or fracture relationships with our potential clients, but then the whole humans that we are, and being able to be vulnerable and share of ourselves in the world. What's that balance? And I think that so often our world wants us to kind of section off into little compartments of ourselves, and yet being able to hold two truths at once and listen for the complexity of that really gives us space to be whole and gives us space to be complex beings, I guess is the easiest way to say it.
Yeah.
So I was hearing you talk about that. I wanted to highlight that we kind of moved beyond already, but I wanted to come back to it. There was this piece that you said about with your kids, how important silliness is and how there's vulnerability in silliness. You had mentioned earlier that there's vulnerability to joy, but there's also this vulnerability to silliness. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what comes up for you as you show up with silliness with your kids and what you're trying to model for them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I remember when I was younger, I didn't like silliness. I didn't like um, joking around too much because it made me feel less in control. It made me feel like things were less predictable. It felt dangerous to have people think I was silly, or I didn't like quite know how to interpret it. Um, and with my kids, it's all about like not taking ourselves too seriously, being able to be more real, and having moments of levity or kind of goofiness, or like saying something that's like ridiculous, or engaging with my son a little bit when he's doing poopy talk, and like not shutting it down right away, because that's what 3-year-olds do. um, and so it's really about just wanting to support them as well as myself self, because there's like an awakening that happens, like things that like got kind of shut down or like repressed, um can kind of like start to grow again, and can start to um be oxygenated and whatnot. And so that's really what it's about. For me, it's about getting down on my knees, and you know yeah, being with them in all those ways.
I love that sort of bi-directional energy that happens when it's like you're trying to model this and not shut down certain things in your kids that maybe felt shut down in you, or that didn't feel like there was permission to really like just let yourself be in as a kid. But
Mm-hmm.
there's also the permission that they give back to you by being normal kids who are just expressing themselves. I love that kind of that
Yeah.
language of oxygenating parts of yourself that maybe didn't get that early
Mm-hmm.
on. It's like both of you are in some ways teaching each other and giving space and permission to each other.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, let's not overthink this.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is fun. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we're laughing, like, we're connecting. And in some ways, we're doing things that are ridiculous, and like, how wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah.
Yeah, allowing space for that to happen, because the life will continue to get more complex for them, and to let this phase be what this phase is about. And also, here's another one of those sort of two truths at once. Like, I tend to see myself as I can be very earnest, and I really like the depths and vulnerability, and I really like I don't stay on the surface for very long. But
Mm-hmm.
I also know that silly side of myself that needs the play to balance things out. I need both in existence. I do that in my role as an instructor teaching other coaches that I teach. I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
go right into the depths with somebody, but I'm also going to play with them. I'm going to do that with my clients. I'm going to do that with my friends and my family. That's such an important balance for me to be able to kind of hold both of those together, or else it just gets too heavy, or else it gets
Mm-hmm.
too thin. And for me, that's how I create balance for myself. And so, as you're saying, like, the silliness is important, allowing that to be there. And for much of your childhood, it sounds like that felt scary, and now you're like learning how to reclaim that part of yourself.
Yeah. It just wasn't as modeled. Silliness just wasn't as modeled in my environments and at family gatherings. Right. And as I said, you know, a very kind of happy childhood where, in a lot of ways, right. But I've also kind of identified some of the ways that it wasn't. But with regard to kind of having parents who weren't forcing me to be a certain way, uh, right, who weren't coming down on me with regard to how I should be as a boy or how I should be with regard to masculinity, but there was still lots of modeling of kind of this is what's expected, or kind of this is how to be in our community. And so I just wasn't getting enough permission or enough invitations, for, yeah, kind of just like those more um, uncalculated, um, unplanned ways of being, but just like spontaneity and like not overthinking it. And, with my son recently, because you asked for examples, like he has this tiny little tent. And so I got inside it and like could barely like my legs were like up along the roof because I could barely fit inside this thing. And my daughter this morning, she doesn't know that she's making fart noises, but she's like making fart noises with her mouth as a way of just like starting to try out different sounds. And so making fart noises back to her and then like both laughing together. I mean, it's incredible as a parent. There's so many countless examples, or just being with like young kids, right? You don't have to be a parent, like just being around young kids. They have so much to teach us about things that adults, I think in general, tend to repress or disconnect from, or that we disconnected from a long time ago, that kids can help us re-enliven.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I started my early parts of my career in sort of like the child development space and the child welfare space. And even I was an investigator for Child Protective Services before becoming a coach. And so even in some of the really darkest, toughest places, the bright spots that these kids would be with me, and just to be able, I have so many fun and amazing stories that made a really tough job worth it and made it really like powerful and let me continue to be fully me, even in sort of rigid systems that were quite punitive in some way rather than actually helping some of the clients. Yeah. And so I do think that children have that ability, and that's why children are often my favorite people in the room to go hang out with. You'll see me go bye and just disconnect from the adults and move over to where the kid is in the room.
Yeah.
I think something you were saying also that's important is that how much children's learning and development is based on what they observe rather than necessarily learning the rules that someone says. Like kids learn so much more about what the parent does versus what they say that the kid should do. Exactly. If you break the rules as a parent, or if you model something different than the rule you're stating, they're going to notice that and they're going to start to behave in that way. And so I think that that's an important thing is that we need to, as we move into talking about the book that you wrote, it's like so much of what we need to do with kids is not teach them more rules, but to help model and give permission and to give space by how we do that work as adults, how we as adult men really show up in the world around them. And so thank you for bringing up that point, because I do think it's important that we don't just tell them that it's okay to be themselves, but that we actually model that and create space for that too.
Yeah. And recognizing that we can only kind of, whether you're a mentor, whether you're a caregiver, whether you're a parent, you're part of the equation, but you're only a part of the equation, kind of for kind of messages and teachings that child is absorbing. And early on, they get a lot more of you. As they get older and head towards adolescence, they start to get a lot less of you and start to care a lot less about what you have to say and more about what their peers have to say. And so I think also for parents, realizing that you can only do so much, and that it ultimately is your child's journey. And so the thing that you can control is what you put out there to them, what is out there in the home environment and when they're with you to see and make sure that you're walking the walk. And then there's going to be a lot of other stuff that they have to navigate on their own that, right, hopefully you've helped foster the type of relationship where when they're feeling confused or overwhelmed, right, and in the case of boys, when they feel like they can come to you and say, this is scary, or this is confusing, or I'm not sure about this.
So what made you want to write this book for teens specifically? Like, I know for me in my own personal journey, that was such a hard point of my life, teenage boys. And so I'm like, ooh, I want to work with the younger kids. I don't necessarily want to work with the teenagers. Those are still part of where my nervous system can lock up. What made you want to write a book towards teens and masculinity?
Well, as I got into this field of boys and men's mental health more, part of it was recognizing that there's a lot more people focused on men and ways that this gender stuff can be problematic for some men and lead to some of the difficulties that we talked about, especially for men who more rigidly prescribe to it. It can lead to big limitations and big emotional deficits. And in the most extreme cases, it can lead to suicide completion. When we look at the disparities and white men, along with some other groups who are at risk, but kind of, in kind of the higher risk groups for that, specifically suicide completion. And so recognizing that most of the field is focused on men, and it's an easier population to research, right? You can be at a college and you can kind of have your Psych 101 study pool that you kind of have access to, and boom, you've got your data and you don't have to pay them very much. But if we're actually going to do, like, if we're concerned that gender and masculinity teachings aren't often serving our boys and men well, but we're not really focused on kind of the boys and the teenagers and like how to kind of reach them constructively and productively around this topic and issue, we're missing the boat a little bit. Like it's a lot, for somebody who has lived most of their life and has kind of like made their their belief systems have concretized and solidified with regard to kind of who they are and how they want to be. Like, it's not that it's, there can't be growth and there can't be self-change. It's just a lot harder. Mm-hmm. It's a lot easier to help somebody emotionally connect and be more emotionally aware and have greater emotional intelligence and literacy if you start that work earlier on. And for me, teenagers have always been intriguing. It's when you can kind of start to have adult conversations with them, right? They can abstract, they can think more complexly, they have more abilities to perspective take than young kids do. And teenagers demand the utmost realness, because if they get any sense that you're being a phony or you're being an adult or an authority figure, they're going to tell you to go F yourself, for the most part. Lots of them will do that. Or if they're polite, they'll just kind of like walk the other way and not want to interact with you. And so I've found for myself that working with teenagers is challenging for those reasons, but also really gratifying for those reasons. And I'm able to connect with teenagers, not all of them. I drop F words sometimes in sessions, or I curse, and I really try to keep it real. And I think with boys and teen boys specifically, it was recognizing that more needs to be done when kids are younger. And the teen years are such a crucial period of identity development and questioning that, like, yes, more needs to be done with younger boys too, because we know from research and ethnographic work and whatnot that's been done, boys start to get messages about suck it up and don't be a girl and all that stuff as young as kindergarten and before. And so those boys also need, adult figures and mentors and people to just support them to make sense of that for themselves. But I decided to focus on teens because it is such a rich period of identity development and trying to find oneself more.
Yeah, I was going to say that finding oneself more. I bet the developmental stage that teenagers are in, where they're individuating from their parents, finding their own identity, that sort of lends to this really like fertile time where growth can happen in different ways than it could before, where someone is mostly just identified with their family of origin versus someone who's actually starting to individuate from that and starting to find their own ways of showing up and their own humor and their own friendships and community. I can imagine that makes it a really interesting time frame.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so if someone picks up this book, the Masculinity Workbook for Teens, what are they going to expect to find in this book?
Yeah, so really, the way I wrote the book is to very much be a non-prescriptive gender journey for masculine identifying teens, although I frankly think plenty of men could pick it up and it would be a really interesting self-exploration for them as well, going through the exercises. But the book is very much set up where the first two chapters are just laying some of the foundations for some of the gender basics and just kind of understanding some of the terminology, understanding just stuff like, what does gender socialization mean? What is social learning? What are gender norms? And then for the reader, starting to explore for themselves what have been some of my experiences and some of my mentors and influential people in those ways, whether it's a figure who has really encouraged me to kind of question dominant ways of being and to be more critical, or whether it's a figure who has really pressured you to conform and kind of pressured you to prove yourself in those more dominant ways. And so starting to make touch with some of those early teachings from influential adults, as well as emotional experiences in relation to those teachings. And then the middle of the book is focused on what I identify and has been identified as others as the key guy code rules that boys are expected to follow. And so I'll actually take up my book quickly because I have it in front of me. And, it's about hiding vulnerable emotions, being tough at all times. Guys should be players and hypersexual. The importance of calling the shots, being an alpha, being in control. The importance of certain activities, specifically sports, over school. And then also, there's a specific rule that's almost like a meta overarching about proving yourself as not like one of those other groups. And there are two specific groups that get framed as being antithetical to dominant masculinity, and it's women and it's gay people. Boys get lots of messages, and it's in the epithets and the slurs, right? Don't be a pussy, don't be a bitch, right? Don't be gay, etc. And I know from talking with adolescent boys that I don't think those epithets are being used quite as much anymore, but they definitely are still getting used. And I know that because I still talk to teenage boys about this stuff, and I've researched it pretty recently. So those chapters on the rules are really to just break down each rule, to kind of talk more about where it comes from, but most importantly, to support the reader in exploring how has that rule worked for them. Has it been helpful? Has it not brought out the best in you? And really supporting them to draw their own conclusions. And then the book really just ends with two summary chapters, one bringing in other identity components and cultural components so that the teen reader presumably can kind of also just do some more intersectional cultural exploration of themselves. Like, what does it mean to be a guy while I also have this other stuff, right? Whether it's race related, sexual orientation related, etc. And then the final chapter is just a summation chapter. And so it's very experiential. There are a lot of activities. There are also sections called Words of Guys, where I just take quotes from other teen guys I've talked to about these things. So
I love that you put in that piece of intersectionality within the work too, because I think so often cisgender heterosexual men don't really have a lot of spaces where they start to look at their intersectionality and where their identities overlap and where they cross over, or where they teach either consistent or conflicting messages. And so I think queer people or women or people of color have to do that work all the time.
Yeah.
But I love that you put that in there, because where are those spaces, as you said, when you were going to college, like where you get invited into those kinds of conversations? Why wasn't I invited in earlier? That invites men into those conversations earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely.
And
so, we've all got it. We've all got culture. We've all got intersectionality. And white hetero cis boys and men are invited to look at them within themselves the least.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Right. And when you're, part of a more dominant group, you also just, it doesn't happen as naturally, versus if you have marginalization, it's like, I know it. I'm reminded of it all the time.
It's in my face
I have to
every
think
day.
about it. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. As I'm listening to you, there sounds like such a deep and rich exploration that's available by getting this workbook. And yet what I also imagine is imagining the teen boys that I've met and been around. If a parent is listening to this and wanting to sort of get this book for their kid, I would imagine the buy-in piece can be a little bit challenging with teen boys. Oh, I'm not going to read about that. Oh, that's dumb. Or like, that's because we haven't invited them into the conversation earlier, to just start all of a sudden with this book might feel like a big step. How do you think we can encourage buy-in in a conversation in a book like this?
Yeah. Well, as we know with teenagers in general, buy-in is a complicated thing. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we're talking to teens in our lives as adults, and we have absolutely no idea if what we're putting out there is being appreciated, if it's being received at all. It might look like it's being rejected. At least I'm not, being told to go away. That's an improvement, but I'm still getting a pretty, stoic, grisly response, or my kids or this teen's not saying very much. And so I think, in some cases it's just buying the book and putting it on your kid's bed. And we just don't know what a teenager is going to do in that type of situation. But, I can definitely imagine teenagers probably aren't going to buy it for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But if it's there, it's like, oh, like I'm not taking a text break from, my buddy or whomever tonight after homework. And like, oh, this is kind of an interesting picture. Like, I wonder like what this thing's all about, and might actually like start leafing through it and getting it pulled in. I also think another way to do it is for dads, parents, caregivers, mentors, right, who have a teen boy in their life somehow, to be very intentional and to say, hey, this is something that I want to do with you. And I've got my copy and you've got your copy. And this is important stuff that we really haven't explored together. The reason that I want to kind of do this journey with you is because this was something that I didn't have. This is exactly what I'll say to Finn, right? Like I didn't have anybody invite me to question these things when I was your age. I didn't have anybody to explore this stuff with and really learn on my own terms how I want to be as a guy. And so I want to be able to be part of that journey with you. And so let's go through this together, and I'll do the exercises and you'll do them. And then let's have some conversations about what we're coming up with. And if there's sections that feel too personal, like, there's a little section on porn, there's a little section on other stuff, we can just skip them, because some of the stuff you might not want to talk about with dad or with mom or with uncle or with mentor, whomever. And then I think another way for boys to get this, and I am starting to have conversations with schools, is to really try to bring this into a social emotional learning wellness type curriculum. It's important for boys to have that opportunity to self-explore in those ways. It's important for kids who identify with other gender groups to also have those opportunities for themselves. And schools are such an important resource and space where kids have where the potential is there, but much more needs to be done to support kids with this type of self-exploration.
I love those examples because they exist in sort of three different levels. It's like at the individual level, at the family of origin, or at the relational level with just your father or your uncle or someone in the family. And then at the where kids spend a lot of their times, which is at school, in their communities and their social networks. I love that those are all available. And I especially love that middle one that you offered around like a father asking a child to do it with them, and to do it with them, not to just say, I think you need to read this book, but to be in that vulnerable process together can be really powerful. And it kind of ties into what we've been talking about around like kids learn from what they see, it being modeled, the permission, the space being opened, rather than just here's a rule that you need to follow.
Exactly. Yeah. And Andrew Smiler comments on this in one of the endorsements, and I think he's been on your show. But a lot of parents, understandably, including myself, it can feel daunting how to have these conversations with your child. And a lot of those more difficult topics are embedded within those books, right? A lot of kids, because of social media, are seeing porn, by the end of middle school, right? Kind of boys are, a really high percentage. I don't know if it's 85 or 90, but it's really like parents need to be talking, caregivers, mentors need to be talking about boys with these subjects, sexual orientation, right, gender identity, et cetera. And so I think, parents do need to put in the work, with their child at a minimum, right? Throw it on your son or throw it on the guy's bed who's, your nephew or who you're mentoring. Right. But ideally, there's an adult who wants to do the journey with them from a respectful place. There might be some things that you're totally up for talking about with me. There might be others that you want to skip over. We can figure out what that is, but let's both do it together and see where we get.
I love that so much. Well, the book is called The Masculinity Workbook for Teens, Discover What Being a Guy Means to You. If people were hoping to pick up that book, when does it come out? Where can they get it? Tell me more about that.
It comes out officially on November 1st. You can get it from Amazon. You can get it through New Harbinger's webpage. Even though it only comes out on November 1st, which is pretty close, I know people are starting to get it in the mail already. You can find out more about it on my webpage, which is chrisreigeluth.com, ChrisReigeluth.com. And I'm always happy people can reach out to me and connect with me through my webpage. And so schools that are interested in thinking about this as part of an SEL or wellness curriculum, parents, other mentors who really want to think about how to use this resource effectively with with their boys and boys in their life, always happy to get that outreach.
I couldn't recommend it more. I can only imagine, as you said, you kind of highlighted it, that even grown men might be interested in this book and learn a lot from it. I think the space that it can give, while it's written for teens, it also, if you're looking to, I think the language you used that I loved earlier was to oxygenate parts of ourselves that didn't get enough oxygen before. There are parts of us that are still stuck in that teenage boy that learned some things that aren't that are limiting us now. There are times where that younger part of ourselves that kind of had to separate from our natural and authentic way of showing up needed to be left behind so we could make it through through experiences of our lives. And yet many of us want to reclaim parts of those. And so this is a way to kind of go back to that young boy and to reclaim and to oxygenate parts of ourselves that we're missing. So I bet it's great for teens, but I also bet it's great for grown men like myself.
I think you're right. And a way that I wrote the book in line with this podcast and the spirit of it was putting myself out there, kind of through memories, through kind of, recall things that were challenging, kind of things that didn't go well. And I think, men would have the chance to revisit some of those more difficult periods and have the opportunity to heal and also just be more connected, right? When do any of us get the opportunity to think more thoughtfully about, what does masculinity mean to us? Right. It can happen through this podcast. It can happen in other ways, but not very often.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important.
For sure. So if you had one last moment to synthesize what your sort of perspective is, or have one offering for a masculine identifying teen or a man that is listening to this podcast, what might you leave them with?
It's something that has already been echoed, so I'll just restate it because it's important. There's a very clear formula for how society wants us to be as boys and men. And when I do presentations, I kind of ask the audience to shout the stuff out, and they kind of shout out all of kind of those classic teachings that we get as boys and men. And what I'd want to leave any listener with is that kind of your gender and your masculine identity is yours and yours alone. And there are lots of ways to be a guy. And some of it can overlap with that kind of more traditional formula. Lots can overlap, or none of it can, and it's all good, right? So figure out for yourself what works for you.
I love that. I love the permission and the space that gives. I think a gay boy like myself growing up could have used that space. So thank you for doing that for the future, for the future kids out there.
Lots of straight boys and men need it too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Maybe even more sometimes.
Yeah.
Well, I so appreciate it. I'll make sure that all of your links and stuff are in the show notes so that people can easily find your information, find you, and find the book. If you want to get in contact with me, you can go to my website at travisstock.com. I'm also on Instagram at Travers03. That's where I do a lot of the ongoing conversations around the new masculine. So if you've listened to this episode and you want to continue participating in the conversation in an active way, find me at Travers03. You can also find me on Patreon. If you want to contribute to the mission of the New Masculine, you can go to patreon.com/thenewmasculine. Again, that's patreon.com/thenewmasculine. Thank you so much, Chris, for joining me, for sharing your work in the world. I'm super excited to share this with my listeners and to hopefully help some of those teen masculine identifying kids out there.
All right. Thank you, Travis, and really valued this time together.
Me too. Thanks.